Having an investigator is so important to a case.
If every case was just based on the complaint, everyone's guilty.
They're not going into this looking for your side of the story, contrary to what they will say.
And you're able to get a not guilty because you followed up on stuff that the police didn't.
It's really criminal defense attorneys asking the court to apply the Constitution the way that it was written.
I don't think I'll ever not be amazed by that.
You have to be hyper prepared because people are going to look at you and assume you don't know what you're doing.
I wouldn't say challenging, really. I'd say more nerve-wracking.
The government has to be held accountable for how they conduct investigations.
But can the state really be prejudiced in a case where they're trying to convict someone, send someone to prison?
I think people don't realize that the police can lie to you in order to get information.
That was a surprise.
Well, it is unfair. Let's talk about why it's unfair.
Everyone just assumes we're horrible people.
People just do not believe that it's possible.
I haven't been threatened yet.
Would somebody feel that way if it was like their family member accused of something? Until white people experience that, it is not going to change. Jason, thank you for coming on the podcast today. Tell us how you got started as a private investigator.
Thank you for having me. So I went to MATC, Milwaukee Area Technical College, for criminal justice. I decided to apply at several different police departments after that. Let's see, it was Baltimore, New Orleans, Denver, Chicago, I think even Milwaukee at one point. And then I just decided to drop out of them because it wasn't for me and everything. So then I worked at a repossession company, doing like desktop investigations, trying to find debtors all across the country. And the whole time I'd thought about being a private investigator. Like I saw the ads, like the want ads online and stuff like that.
Sure.
But it was all surveillance, and that just doesn't, it sounded horrible. And now since I've been a PI, I've taken a few surveillance cases, but they're grueling. So
would you say that the bulk of the work that you do is supporting criminal defense attorneys in terms of their cases, or what does that breakdown look like for you?
Yes, I'd say about 99% is criminal defense work that I do.
Okay. So how did you get into that avenue? Because I know, when you start your own business and you're first getting started, you have to kind of acquire a client base, right? And so it's very much a relationship-based type thing. How did you get connected with attorneys that were looking to hire somebody to work with them?
So I actually had postcards made. There's a company in Texas, it's called Investigator Marketing. I hired them to make postcards and a website initially and a bunch of things like that. Then I just mailed postcards out to attorneys, and my first call was a private OWI case. So at that point I thought they were all going to be private at the private rate. So it was a shock when they weren't after that. But yeah, that's how it started.
That's awesome. And honestly, that makes a lot of sense. I think people will be surprised at how well you can do with any kind of like direct marketing to just get your name out there, because people are always looking for something. They just don't necessarily know where you are. So that's interesting. So one of the things that I tell clients, so I do a lot of kind of phone consultations to kind of get a sense for if, somebody's going to be a fit for me or what type of case they have. And obviously we can't know all the issues until we really get into the discovery, so all the evidence in the case. But having an investigator is so important to a case. I think that when you look at a criminal complaint, for example, I think that many times the state thinks, well, this is pretty cut and dry. I've laid it all out. Here are my best facts. And I always tell people the criminal complaint is not the be-all, end-all. It's kind of a summary of the state's best version of events. And a lot of times there are pieces of the puzzle that are missing. So from your perspective, how do you kind of unpack a file, right? An attorney says, hey, I want to work with you. Here's what I think some of the issues are. Here's what I want you to do. What goes through your mind or your process when you first get handed a new file?
So first of all, I want all the discovery. I want body cam, interrogation videos, inventories, police reports, everything. Because like you just mentioned, the criminal complaint, it's just the state's facts. There's always bad facts in there for the state. So yeah, I want all the discovery so I can look through everything. So I go through the police reports first, then I make a summary about what everyone is saying in there. Then I watch either the body cam or the squad video or the interrogation videos. And as you know, there's always stuff that's left out.
Of course.
Yeah. So
we'd be out of a job if there wasn't stuff that seems to be missing.
Right. If every case was just based on the complaint, everyone's guilty.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that one of the interesting things that you had touched on in terms of your background is that you were looking to get into law enforcement. You ended up going a completely different direction with that. How do you think your perspective as somebody who's not a law enforcement officer, because a lot of investigators have law enforcement backgrounds, how do you think that that difference of perspective kind of, shapes how you approach a case?
So first, coming in when I first got my license and started doing criminal defense work, I thought it was going to be just completely wrong, but I thought it was going to be more, showing that the police were right. Mm-hmm. And from the very first case I've had, it's not showing where stuff's missing or there's this lead they didn't follow up on. Why didn't they follow up on that? So my views have really changed on that. I think it was Alan Dershowitz that said he goes into every case thinking that his client is guilty and wants to show where the police are wrong.
Sure.
I do the opposite. I believe all of my clients that they're not guilty, and then I go in that way to show, why wasn't this lead followed up on? Why wasn't that lead followed up on? Why wasn't this person talked to? Why wasn't this piece of evidence followed up on? Things like that. So my views completely changed as to, where I first came in thinking that, I was just going to not do much to help the defense out.
Yeah.
And now it's, critical to every case.
Well, that really resonates with me too, because I think when I was a very young associate, I remember, I would go into my first boss's office to kind of look at files, right? And I remember there being, conversations where I'm looking at this set of reports and I'm like, I don't know what to do with this because it seems so obvious that, this person must be guilty, right? And I think one of the aspects about defense work is you have to get creative in thinking outside of the box, right? If my client didn't do this, explain how, right? And so it's a weird dynamic, right? Because we don't have the burden of proof. Prosecutor has the burden of proof. Right. But to some extent, you're kind of trying to prove your client's innocence. And that is so backwards just in terms of how it works from a practical perspective. But I think that's the truth of it when you're trying to uncover all this stuff. And so I know that over time, as I gained more experience and got into different kinds of cases, that evolved, and that creative aspect, just being able to think outside of the box or really kind of brainstorm, okay, what angle do I want to take with that? It definitely takes time. So I can see where that has evolved and shifted for you over the course of, taking on more cases. So yeah, right. That makes complete sense. Mm-hmm. So what kinds of cases do you really like doing? Or do you kind of, you just like doing everything that falls under the criminal defense umbrella?
Homicide cases are my favorite just because I take that back, federal cases.
Okay.
Any type of federal case, just because there's so much discovery. I love just sitting there and going through it and nitpicking it. And with, other cases like a fleeing or something, obviously there's not going to be as much.
Sure.
So I love sitting there and nitpicking it and then picking out witnesses that I need to go talk to. At the beginning of every case, I print out the jury instructions for the specific charges, and then I talk to people. I follow up on open records requests, follow up on maybe some bullet casings via NIBIN reports that weren't produced or something like that. So there's a lot that goes into it. But yeah, I'd say probably federal, then homicide, and then I don't know. All the other cases.
Everything. That's so funny that you bring up pulling the jury instructions, because that was very much the first thing that I was taught how to do. I was an associate at Kim and Lavoie for a couple of years before I left, and John and Julius, I have so much respect for because they're really good attorneys, and I think that experience for me really shaped how I approach a case in general, especially with Julius having come from a prosecutor background, right? Which is a totally different lens. So pulling the jury instructions, you would be shocked. I think people would be shocked. You probably wouldn't be shocked at how how there's kind of like a misalignment sometimes, or just a complete like misunderstanding or just a misperception of the facts, right? I think there tends to be a lot of tunnel vision when it comes to law enforcement investigation. And I don't say that to be critical of all law enforcement. I think that they do a tough job. It's a job that I personally don't want to do. I'm going to be honest.
Correct.
But that being said, because they are the government, right, there's a certain standard of what they should be doing if they are going to pursue something that takes away somebody's life or liberty, right? I mean, that should be a common sense principle. And so I'm shocked when, you'll look at a file and you'll realize, okay, there was literally a witness right there, and nobody thought to talk to this person. Nobody thought to see if this business right next door had any kind of surveillance video that would have shown exactly what took place. Like it's wild because people assume that all of these cases, especially very serious ones, when we're talking about super serious felony cases, are thoroughly investigated.
Right.
And I think that that's why the public is oftentimes shocked, like, why is this person having a trial on this case? Because the sound bites that they see in the media, whatever they see, in the paper and Facebook comments or whatever, is just so different than knowing what happens behind the scenes. Would you agree?
Yeah, definitely. Following up on, witnesses is part of that. I mean, I've had a homicide case fairly recently where family members were saying that the police should talk to the deceased children's father. Mm-hmm. But they never did. They never followed up on that at all. And like, he fit the description that an eyewitness gave. Yeah, that's
seems pretty
kind
important.
of the face I made.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I couldn't wrap my head around it. So I went and I talked to him. He was able to provide an alibi and back it up, not just say he was with, mom or something, but show proof. So obviously that ruled him out. But like, just to not do that when you're told that by the victim's family, it's crazy to me.
Well, and it doesn't make sense from the perspective of, I think a lot of, police and prosecutors kind of take the position of, well, I understand that we represent the state and we don't necessarily represent victims. But the reality is that, that's all happening in very close, kind of tandem with whatever the victim's interests are in a lot of cases, not all the time. But, to not follow up on stuff like that just seems like really basic. I mean, Do you think the problem is resources? I mean, why do you think that happens?
I think part of it is resources. I also think part of it is the tunnel vision that you mentioned before. In that particular case, I don't know if they were just getting so many leads at once or what it was.
Sure.
But resources is definitely part of it. It's definitely, through other investigations, it's a problem that I've seen where they can't, obviously if they had billions of dollars, they could do basically what I do. Not that they necessarily would, but they could, and follow up on things that are in the reports and things that even aren't in the reports. It's definitely resources, but also the tunnel vision where they try to just get so focused on one client because one particular witness said something or they found something on the scene that ties the client there.
That makes sense. So can you tell us how that case turned out? I have a couple ideas of what may have happened, but I can also say that, in a perfect society, a case like that should be dismissed, right? Mm-hmm. But that's not always the case.
It was not. It did go to trial. It was all circumstantial, and he was found guilty.
Yeah.
I believe he's appealing it right now.
Interesting. Yeah, I think those are interesting cases too, because I talk to folks a lot about like this concept of what is evidence, right? And there are definitely cases with a lot of strong direct evidence, right? Mm-hmm. There's also cases that are circumstantial. And to me, with my criminal defense lens, I look at some of this and I say, like, I don't understand how somebody could have convicted this person based on this. But I also try to take a step back, and part of the reason that I like talking about these issues so much is because I know that, somebody like myself or somebody like you with the training that we have are going to view those things probably different than or differently than what the general public might. Because when you think about our entertainment that's surrounding like criminal justice topics, right? I don't even like using the phrase criminal justice. I say criminal legal system. But that being said, right, like so many of the shows are from the perspective of the police and the prosecution. And then you'll get occasionally like you're making a murder or something like that. And there's always a lot of pushback, right?
Right.
And I get it. You know, these things are for entertainment. But when we talk about what brings these issues to the forefront, you know, it probably doesn't get much more raw than like your court TV stuff. And sometimes people are still baffled at like, I don't understand how X piece of evidence comes in or was left out because it seems so important. So, yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lot of sides to it.
Yeah, like touched on a very current case that just got a mistrial yesterday, the Karen Reed case.
Yeah.
Where the jury wasn't able to know about the FBI investigation into it. I understand why it wasn't allowed in, because it's prejudicial to the state. But can the state really be prejudiced in a case where they're trying to convict someone and send someone to prison? I mean,
It's interesting too, because one of the things, and I'll just like admit, I've followed this a little bit on Twitter, but I guess it's called X now. My feed is just flooded with everything from the Young Thug trial.
That's a good one too.
Which is just wild because it almost seems like it's a docudrama. Like it almost seems like it's for entertainment, because some of the stuff that's going on is just so egregious and wild that it's like, is this real life right now? But those are, I think, important cases to highlight, because until certain cases get publicity, it doesn't bring those issues into, you know, the public sphere as far as conversation. So people are saying like, why is this happening? I don't understand. That seems unfair. Well, it is unfair. Let's talk about why it's unfair, right?
Right.
And so I will say that is one aspect with social media that I think has been beneficial to kind of create some transparency with how the court process works and what actually happens in a criminal case.
Right. Yeah. I mean, but just think if Karen Reed didn't have the defense that she does, if Young Thug didn't have the money that he has to have the defense that he does, and to not be televised, like the public would never know. Yeah. It's crazy to me how seeing some of like appointed clients or SPD clients, how they're treated, and motions that aren't granted that literally have the legal basis for them.
Yeah.
It's crazy.
I think one thing that's really interesting about it too is like, I mean, there's kind of, you're going to get good attorneys, you're going to get bad attorneys of every kind, right? Yep. I think sometimes people think, well, if I have a public defender, then my case is going to be tanked. And I usually tell people on the phone, if they call and I see that they have a public defender, I was like, you know, honestly, like, it might be somebody that I know. I was like, this is a really good attorney. Like, you should be very happy that you have this attorney appointed to your case. Please don't think that just because they are a public defender that they are not exceptionally good at their job. You know, on the other hand, when we're talking about appointed cases, I think that's where things get a little grayer, because quite honestly, they need people to be taking cases. And I understand that. There is a huge shortage, particularly in Wisconsin, but all over the country, of people willing to take public defender appointed cases for a variety of reasons, especially in rural counties, but there's issues everywhere. I mean, I think just about every time that I've recently been in Milwaukee, there's been a State v. Lee hearing for many cases, and which is basically a hearing to see kind of like the status of appointing an attorney on a case. And they're usually very serious cases, so they're loss of life cases, generally, because when the public defender's office cannot take a case, there's an internal conflict of some kind. They have to appoint it out to a private attorney that accepts public defender appointments. And there's a very limited group of attorneys that are certified through that particular program to take cases at that level, which sounds like a great idea in theory. Where the issue becomes, or where the issue presents itself, is who's going to take these cases? Do they have the capacity to take them? Right. All of that kind of stuff. So it's not just in homicide cases, but it is something that, you know, as a private attorney, like, you'll get emails of like so many cases that they're looking to get somebody on. I'm not currently taking PD cases right now. And I get asked all the time, and part of me feels bad for not taking them. Right. But also, you know, that's like a whole conversation about, you know, what the compensation structure looks like and all of that good stuff. So, I mean, it's frustrating for people to feel like if I pay for an attorney, I'm going to get better representation, because it's not always true, But sometimes it is true that you're
Right.
treated completely differently.
Yeah.
Or people will walk in and assume, and they'll see somebody and they'll assume that you must be an appointed attorney when this person is paid, plenty of money to hire an attorney. So like,
Right.
I think all of those things in terms of like stereotypes and just kind of, I guess, assumptions about clients and that sort of thing, it definitely bleeds into the process, whether or not people like to admit that. I mean, you see it regularly.
All the time. All the time. With like appointed work or SPD work, sometimes there's pushback on getting funds for a PI or for a biomechanical expert or, a psychologist or psychiatrist, or it's public defender's office. Like you said, there's really good attorneys there, and they have the ability to get more of that funding, at least in my understanding.
Okay.
But I mean, they also have that negative stigma, which is unfortunate.
I think too, from like a political perspective, right? So the PD's office as well as the DA's office, like all of that funding is so politicized.
Yes.
And I think unfortunately the vast majority of people, because it becomes a political issue, because it becomes something that it really shouldn't be, don't necessarily see the value in supporting our public defender's office as a way that we want to support our DA's office. I think just from a popularity perspective, that's not viewed as the same kind of situation. And so I have a lot of respect for people who are in the trenches doing PD work. But it's definitely something where, why Wisconsin was at the bottom of the barrel for appointed cases in terms of that rate for so long. We probably are still on the lower end of that. I don't know for sure.
I'm pretty sure Wisconsin is.
Yeah. And so it becomes a challenge, right, when we're trying to get coverage for people. And I think the general public doesn't maybe necessarily see the value of, these aren't just situations where a criminal defense attorney's role is not to just like get someone off, right? And I think that is kind of the perception, right? To get somebody who's guilty out of, any consequences for their conduct.
Yes.
But like there's a lot of other situations where there are diversion programs, other treatment things that are really important when we're talking about public safety and just the community as a whole that are overlooked in that conversation because people think that, doing this job is inherently like shady for some reason. So I always try to bring those aspects into the conversation because I do think that it's so important, and I don't know, I think it's overlooked.
Yeah, I run into that too when I go try to interview witnesses. I like to just show up. I really don't like to call unless they're a friendly witness. I always say I'm a private investigator, defense investigator. I usually say the defendant's name. I usually say the attorney's name, and then they look at me like, how can you work with those people? Like, that's not what it is. I gather facts. That's all I do.
Right.
I've never have and never will manipulate a single thing to get someone off because I can't change all of the other facts.
Right.
We definitely have a negative stigma.
What do you think? I mean, is it challenging just going up to somebody and trying to get them to talk to you? Because it's interesting from my perspective of, like we'll hire somebody and say, hey, go do this. But I'm not the one knocking on your door by and large. Right. And there's a reason for that too. I think a lot of people don't realize the reason that attorneys don't directly want to be involved in that conversation is because if that conversation deviates, I cannot testify then as a witness to that conversation. I can't testify in my client's case. So to have somebody like you creates a little bit of a buffer in the event that for some reason that person's story changes when we get to trial, which it can happen.
It has happened. Yeah. I wouldn't say challenging really. I'd say more nerve-wracking.
Yeah.
Because I don't know what their reaction is going to be. I mean, I've had instances where I think it's going to be really negative, and then it's not. It's really pleasant. I've been invited in to go sit and talk with people and talk for an hour or two. There's been other ones where like it's an acquaintance of the defendant and they just won't talk to me.
Sure.
And I haven't been threatened yet. Hopefully I never am, but I mean it's nerve-wracking walking up and not having any idea how they're going to treat you or talk to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think, one of the things that I get a lot is that people seem to think that by virtue of the job that I would feel unsafe around clients or anything like that. I have not personally experienced that. And I can say in just over 7 years, like I have not experienced that at all. Even with people that are in custody, which I think surprises a lot of people in general. Do you feel like when you interact with clients, I mean, would you feel the same way about that?
I'm more nervous about going up to a random door than I am meeting with a client. I think most of them understand that we're there to, try to help them and get the facts so they get a fair trial.
Right.
I've never felt like that. My mom is more worried about it than I am.
Oh yeah.
So most of our clients, by nature of the cases that I work on, are in custody.
Right.
And I've never felt unsafe with one. I usually do contact visits, so there's no glass between us.
Right.
I've never felt unsafe.
Yeah, I get that from my parents too. And it's interesting because I think that, people kind of have an idea from TV and movies of like what a prison visit or a jail visit looks like. And there's kind of all different varying levels. I mean, you can go and just sit with somebody in a room, depending on the prison that you go up to. I mean, you might be in kind of more of like an open space, depending on all of that, or it's not a situation where by and large somebody is necessarily like shackled at that particular juncture. So I think people are surprised that do you like feel comfortable in the same room as this person? I was like, honestly, most of the time, like you said, we are the only people listening to that client's story, and I think they definitely like appreciate that. I think what frustrates me sometimes is like I've had cases where we've lost and, we've put up what I thought was a really good fight, and you just feel so disappointed. But a lot of times people are really grateful that like you gave them the opportunity to like tell their story.
Right.
I don't think that people realize, how often cases resolve with a plea. And so the idea of being able to tell the judge your story, right, present all of your side of things, it doesn't happen all the time.
Right.
It actually doesn't happen that much unless you are somebody that does end up trying a ton of cases, which I have become that person. But that being said, I mean, it's an interesting dynamic because I do feel like some people just want their story out. And they want to have their day in court. And it doesn't necessarily feel like that when we're going through the procedural motions of just kind of the day in and day out.
All the status conferences and stuff.
Yeah, for sure. So do you go to trial and like sit at counsel's table to like help with cases? I mean, I know some people do that. Some people like having an extra person. Otherwise, I mean, do you try to like, be around for that? Like what, is your kind of way of approaching cases when they do end up going to trial?
I try to go on like the Monday or Tuesday that trial is going to start just to see if anything is needed of me at all.
Sure.
I haven't sat at counsel table yet. There's a homicide case last year that I was going to, but it got dismissed the Thursday before the Monday trial.
Okay.
So that was really the only one. I think I'm going to have a pro se guy going to trial relatively soon, and I'll probably sit at the table then.
Okay.
But other than that, I haven't. But I try to make myself available in case anything comes up or last minute subpoenas or rides for someone.
Yeah.
So
I think, investigators are really kind of like our right-hand people. Certainly not for every single case that we do. I mean, your drunk driving case, that's your standard, like straightforward drunk driving case, probably isn't going to involve too much of that, but you never know. I mean, there's always specific circumstances where that could be useful. Yep. But I do think that, when you look at all of the resources that the state has, it's a lot, right? Yeah. And when we're kind of going back to the idea of like the state being prejudiced, I understand the law says what it does, but from the other perspective, they have a ton of resources, and they're usually coming from big offices with a lot of support staff, paralegals. I mean, even some of the really good criminal defense firms, they're small businesses. Like, they're considered pretty small, right? You know, they may have a support staff person or two, and a couple attorneys, and like, that's the team. So bringing on somebody as an investigator is so helpful in a lot of ways, because I think, you know, people have an idea of what it is that you can do, but you can actually do a lot of things that can be really helpful throughout the process that a case unfolds.
Right. Yeah. And going on that, it always amazes me when I see or hear of like not guilties.
Yeah.
You know, like you said, the resources that the state has to do everything to try to shift the jury to guilty. And then there's like a sole PI, a sole attorney, maybe a paralegal, and that's it. And you're able to get a not guilty because you followed up on stuff that the police didn't.
Yeah.
I don't think I'll ever not be amazed by that.
It's a great feeling. Like, it's always a nerve-wracking feeling too. Like, whenever the jury walks in, like, I still feel sick, and I don't care if it's you know, a low level misdemeanor case or something that's much more serious. Like, I'm nervous. And I usually try to like look over, and if the jurors actually like look at me, usually that's a better sign if they're actually willing to make eye contact with me. But you never know. And it's like that kind of pivotal moment where, you know, I think to some extent it's very different when you represent an individual client versus representing the state, right? Like, it's a totally different dynamic. And I think that, you know, they have victims that they communicate with and they're involved with over the course of a case. But I think the dynamic that you have as an attorney in a defense position is so different that you very much become invested in that person's story. At least you should be, right?
Yes.
That, you know, that final moment is just so nerve-wracking. And it's weird to some extent too, right? Because you like, okay, so you get the not guilty. Okay, well, you know, that's fine. You're discharged from bond. See you later. Maybe that took 2 years of your life or more. Especially for people that, you know, are adamant about, I didn't do anything wrong. Like, I want to fight to clear my name, right? So you have situations where it's like, people have asked me, like, what do I do from here? Like, what is my recourse? I'm like, there really isn't any. I mean, you know, they'll say, well, the system worked the way that it should, and, you know, congratulations, and then move on with your life, right? Without any real concern for the reputational damage, any of that stuff, the financial cost, really all of those things. You know, I think about out-of-state clients that I've had too that like had to fly up here. You know, some people would just never come back to court and like you know, just like leave an open warrant on their case. But to come back to court to participate in that process and like face the consequences, I think is, you know, certainly takes courage in its own way. Especially when you feel like, you know, this is ridiculous and I shouldn't be charged with this, which kind of brings me to another issue, right? Like, the obligations of a defense attorney are very different than, you know, the ethical obligations of a prosecutor. In some ways they align because attorneys all have to follow ethical rules, but, you know, a prosecutor has a unique duty to like, you know, really look at something and say, can I prove this case beyond a reasonable doubt? Because if I can't, I shouldn't be bringing these charges, right? And, you know, that's an interesting discussion where, you know, there are definitely some prosecutors that are reasonable enough that you can sit down with and say, hey, like, based on the work that, you know, you've done, right? This isn't adding up. Like, you got to let this go. And there are definitely some that will do that.
Yes, definitely.
I'm finding that, you know, that is probably something that comes with being more senior, as opposed to, you know, folks just starting out. I think that is something that, again, you gain over time, kind of the experience to say, you know, is this the hill that I want to die on? But yeah, I mean, I would say, I mean, how many times, I mean, I guess if you could quantify it, I mean, do you think that your work has resulted in, you know, a prosecutor changing their tune about a particular case that they were very convinced that your client had, you know, committed?
Yeah, I mean, in the last, I was trying to think about this before I came on. I think it's the last 2.5 years I've had 5 homicide dismissals for cases.
That's very impressive, by the way.
Thank you.
Life-saving work.
Yeah, and again, it's just following up on stuff that they didn't or weren't able to or didn't know about. But yeah, going with the more senior prosecutors like you talked about. I think that, when I write my report and give it to the defense attorney, so I give my notes to the defense attorney. They decide if they want it to be a report.
Sure.
And then pass it along. But yeah, I've seen younger prosecutors like dig their heels in more and take it to trial, and then they lose with a relatively quick verdict, and they just go about their day.
Well, it's weird. I mean, right? Like, I mean, to a certain extent, it's like, life goes on. There's more files, right? And
right.
You kind of lose, I think, to some extent, the perspective by not having a client. I mean, I'll tell you this: the biggest issue that I have that I keep seeing these days is, with respect to, I would say mostly DV and sex assault work is, I don't care, I believe the victim, right? Like,
yes,
there may be
100%.
nothing else
Yes.
that actually corroborates what happened, or, there may be things that just blatantly do not make sense. And the response that, you'll get sometimes is, well, I don't care, I believe this person, and they want to go forward with the trial, right? Mm-hmm. So, that is frustrating. I think that in the wake of having a lot of highly publicized trials involving sensitive crimes, right? Like all over social media, that kind of thing. And, not necessarily super recently, but over the past couple of years, I think conversations about those issues have come up. And one thing that people are always shocked to find out is that testimony is evidence, right? Doesn't seem like it should be enough, right? Somebody just says something about me, and I am now in criminal court facing these charges, and I have to basically defend myself. But how do you prove those things, right? So I think that's an aspect that is a unique but delicate situation, because I've always felt that, being selective about the kinds of cases that go forward when we're talking about sensitive crimes cases, I think is so important, because the idea of believing everybody that brings an accusation really does a disservice to people who are real victims of those crimes. 100%.
Yes. Because
it then erodes the credibility of people bringing those claims, particularly when it's really tough to do so. And, I think that jurors are common sense people by and large. I think the CSI effect cuts both ways, right? Like sometimes there's things where people want to see more, right? And that's not to say that something doesn't necessarily happen, but I think that those are the cases where I get the most frustrated, when they are cases that really don't have a whole lot other than somebody's statement, right? We don't have forensic, right, evidence. We don't have any kind of DNA, which is a whole nother can of worms. I don't think people think that. I think people have an idea of what DNA evidence actually is, but what that means is like totally different.
Yes.
I find a lot of those things really fascinating. But yeah, I mean, people, want something to like hang their hat on, and sometimes it's not there. And I think, that may be an unpopular opinion, but I often think about, would somebody feel that way if it was like their brother, right? Their family member accused of something, so serious, like would they actually still think that we should just believe everybody just because they've said something? So that's going to be an unpopular take. I know that, but
probably, but I mean, I just had a not guilty on a child sex assault case last week. I think Friday the jury came back, but it was a late disclosure, like 15 years later. I won't get too much into it.
Sure.
But I mean, there were tons of holes, and I won't come on and say lies, because I don't think that was, I don't know what her intention was.
Sure.
But there were a lot of holes in what she told police as to what I was able to find.
Sure.
And it just, things didn't line up. And thankfully, the jury got it right, because I do think there was plenty of reasonable doubt.
And that's such a weird concept, too. Like, a reasonable doubt it's even still hard to describe, right? We've got our charts, we've got these, like, analogies that we use, and you still are kind of trying to figure out how to, like, articulate it. But it's such an amorphous thing. And I think what I've always liked to use as an analogy is that beyond a reasonable doubt is a higher burden of proof than the government needs to take your kids away, right? Like, that's a
good one.
pretty like,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a pretty tangible consequence, right? But I still think people struggle with that. I think
Yes.
people think that they don't necessarily like feeling like, oh, there might be something wrong here. But on the other hand, I found a lot of juries to be very thoughtful. Like, they are very thoughtful when they're doing their job. I think that people, by and large, want to participate and they want to do a good job and they want to get it right. But on the other hand, right, you know, as we know, juries don't always see all the information that we see. And sometimes it's really important information, but if the court says we can't use that, they're never going to know about it.
Yeah, that can be scary. I've had a child sex assault last year where he was ultimately found guilty, and the jury basically said that they believed the child. They had no reason to not believe the child, I think is their exact wording. But yeah, there was a lot of stuff that was excluded, right or wrong. There was a lot that was excluded, and yeah, just to see the whole case in front of you, and then to see just the little portion that actually comes into a trial.
Right.
Yeah, that was a surprise when I first got started.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea of like fairness and what is fundamental fairness and what do the courts say and what can come in, when can it come in, and those kinds of things, I think they're always issues worth like diligently pursuing. But I think that, you know, sometimes the courts are not going to rule in a way that is favorable, and you have to do the best you can. And then, you know, I mean, we have appellate courts for a reason, but I mean, those are things where like it just kind of feels like a sucker punch, right? Like it's not a good feeling.
Right.
Especially too, because I think that a lot of times clients want to bring up things that are not necessarily, well, they're probably what you would consider character evidence, right?
Yes.
100%. Like, I can't just get up there and say you're a good guy just because you're a good guy. And I know you're a good guy, but that's not, you know, what the court is going to allow. You know, and it's interesting too, because there are different jurisdictions that do things very differently. Like I had a girlfriend who was briefly practicing in California, and she said that they do allow you to bring in like tons of character witnesses in a different way. So, I mean, it just varies based on where you're practicing. And so I don't know the ins and outs of that, but she said that it was just very different in terms of what things look like here. But yeah, I mean, what do you do when you have like a really key piece of evidence, right? You know, you've presented the argument and the court rules against you. I mean, you know.
Yeah, that's one of the hardest things. Like, 'cause then sometimes the attorney comes back to me like, can you try to get this another way? And so like a lot of times that comes up like in police reports. I do open records requests. I found, let's just say it's a sex assault. They've accused other people before in the same exact way.
Right.
It gets excluded. So then, I mean, I feel that the only way to get it in is to talk to the alleged victim about it.
Right.
Which, who's going to admit that they accuse these people in the same exact way?
Right.
You know? And yeah, it's hard.
And so people understand there's this thing called rape shield, which basically says that you cannot bring up evidence at trial of an alleged victim's prior sexual, sexual acts, conduct, in order to basically say, well, it's more or less likely that this person didn't commit this or whatever the case may be. There are very limited circumstances under which that can come in. And so the idea behind it is we don't want somebody to come in and essentially slut shame somebody into acquitting somebody, which is a good thing. That's a good thing out of a matter of policy. However, there are some circumstances where there's really important information that is very relevant that could point to an alternate person being involved or something else where depending on how that ruling goes, that could be a huge factor that the jury never hears about, right? So those are things where, again, there are a lot of rules that go beyond just whether or not a piece of evidence is relevant to the case. There's still a lot of parameters that, and there's always strategic value in, how do you want to pursue this? Do you want to bring it up ahead of time in emotion? Some of those big things you definitely should. Other things, if you don't have to tip your hand, sometimes that's helpful too. But those are considerations that I think people don't always necessarily realize, right? So there's all of this pretrial litigation that really sets the ground rules of the game. Yeah. And a lot of that is stuff that I think, you know, had jurors known about it, might have changed the outcome of a case.
Right.
In a very material way, right? So I think that these are things where, again, it's hard to kind of consider in the abstract until you find yourself in that position. I hope nobody finds themselves in a position where they're wrongfully accused of something. But it can happen. I mean, it can happen. We know that it does happen, which is really scary.
Yeah. Yeah. Seen it too much.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about interrogations, because you talked about watching interrogation videos as part of that. I think that that is an aspect where, you know, a lot of times people will say, I don't understand why somebody said that they did something, but they actually didn't do it, right? Like that doesn't compute. And I get it, right? I mean, it doesn't necessarily make sense. Why would you say something if you really were innocent? Why would you not just, you know, insist on being innocent? And one of the interesting things is that once you kind of delve into police training on interrogations and all that kind of stuff, is it kind of doesn't matter what you say, which direction you say. It literally doesn't matter, because if you do not deny the allegation strongly enough, that's definitely an indicator of guilt. But on the other hand, if you do, well, you're definitely lying and you're also still guilty. So how do you win, right? That's why I tell people there is literally nothing that you can say to police that will make your situation better, but there's a hell of a lot you can say to make it worse. So don't be talking to the police.
Ever. Yeah, it's... Yeah, because they'll, you know, a witness tells them that the defendant got there at 1 p.m. So then they interview now. They interview the defendant, and he says, yeah, I got there about 1:05. You just corroborated that witness. And then they say something, he pulled up in a black car. Yeah, I pulled up in a black car. Just every little thing that defendants say corroborates their witness and makes their witness stronger. I haven't run into like an actual full-on false confession yet. But yeah, just please take every little thing that a witness says. 'Cause, you know, that's why they put someone in there. They put the defendant in the room, interrogation room. They go back, they line up their points that they want. Right. And then I see it time after time. They just get the defendant to agree to all of these different points. And then they basically just say he confessed, which it's not. Right. It's close, but it's not.
Well, you bring up a really good point in that people think that they're sharing innocuous details, but they've now placed themselves somewhere where if they're already being looked at as suspect number one, now you've admitted that you're in that location, you were there at that time frame, and you at least had some interaction with the person that's the victim. So, I mean, we have this natural human instinct to want to explain away because we think that it's some self-preservation thing. But, you know, the reality is the police are trained on how to obtain a confession. And they're not going into this looking for your side of the story, contrary to what they will say. You know, it's your side of the story. You know, it'll help you out. It'll sound really good. And I can't make any promises. But you know, whatever, we'll get you out of here. But it's just something that, like, you know, I wish that this concept was taught in middle school or honestly early on, because these concepts of what your constitutional rights are, just from a basic sense, you know, in terms of, like, you know, the right to remain silent, you know, asking for an attorney, all of those kinds of things, you know, the fact that you don't have to consent to a search, all that stuff. It's like, the reality is those are so important that, you know, it just, I mean, I can't stress on how important it is. And I've talked to parents too that like, you know, they'll call and they'll say, oh, like, you know, the cops wanted to talk to my kid, but my kid's a minor, so they definitely don't, you know, they can't do that without me present. So I walked him down to the cop shop, and oh, by the way, they shut the door in my face, and now my kid's been charged with a felony. So it's like, you know, all this stuff that is just so frustrating, because I think that, you know, gone are the days by and large of, like, you know, your kind of neighborhood cop, like, just giving you a ride home and calling it a day. Like, it's not that attitude anymore. And I've always said that I think until people experience that, quite honestly, I've always said, like, until white people experience that, it is not going to change on a fundamental level, because people just do not believe that it's possible that that would happen. And so Fortunately, I mean, I'm glad that more of these videos are now becoming available through open records on social media, all that kind of stuff. Because it is important to kind of be a watchdog in a sense, to have the public know like how these things are going on.
Right. Yeah. My TikTok feed is just full of videos.
Yeah.
Like that. Yeah. Where, it's cops, I don't know, just trying to talk to people. And I've seen some where people are like, no, I'm not going to. I don't have to.
Yeah.
And then the cop, just constantly pushes back, which understandable. Their job is to get you to talk.
Right.
And to incriminate yourself. But yeah, I've also seen videos where kids, even convicted felons, they still talk.
Right.
And that part doesn't make sense to me. The convicted felons,
like
the repeat offenders that we get, they still talk.
Yeah.
And sometimes they say a lot more than they ever needed to if they even wanted to just try to clear their name.
Right.
Just don't talk.
Yeah.
Don't talk.
It's literally that simple. I mean, I have always said that, if they're coming to get a statement from you, they've got everything else they need. They're just looking for the icing on the cake to tie it all together. That's literally it.
They want your confessions, so there is no trial.
Or
wrap it up quick.
Or they don't, have anything at all or enough, and they want to, roll the dice and see if they can get one, right? So, I mean, it always frustrates me more than anything when there's something that's so circumstantial and then somebody throws themselves under the bus. Mm-hmm. It's very frustrating.
Yes.
And a lot of people would say like, oh, well, that's so shady. Like, how can you want people to get out of something that they've done or whatever? And it's like, well, I think the government has to be held accountable for how they conduct investigations. They have to be held accountable for how they do these things, because that in and of itself is I think such a fundamental concept, right? And if the Constitution or anything means anything, like those things have to apply.
Right.
And it was always interesting too, because somebody else had told me a while back now that it's really criminal defense attorneys asking the court to apply the Constitution the way that it was written. And it's the state usually asking for exceptions to the rule, right? Like when you think of like suppression motions, right? And you should say like, nope, this is not permissible under the Fourth Amendment. And usually it's the state asking for, well, this should apply because of X, Y, and Z. Or maybe, but, community caretaker or,
it's a good point. I never thought of it like that.
Yeah. Which is funny because nobody thinks... I mean, like, it's just a weird juxtaposition, right? What do you do in terms of like continuing education? Are there things like that where you can go and connect with other people to kind of brainstorm and collaborate? Like, what does that look like for you?
Yeah, so I'm a member of the Criminal Defense Investigation Training Council out of Florida. They have I think they have accelerated courses, but it's like a week-long program where you go down there. Brandon Perrin, the founder of it, has a book that I read before I got my license and everything. But he breaks down like a whole process. I have in my files when I first start, I have like bullet points from his, but it's kind of adjusted a little bit for working up here in Wisconsin, and two for things that I've found to help me be successful. But it's like a whole program, case prep, witness interviews, background checks, go to the crime scene, take pictures, a lot of things like that. So yeah, he's got a class down there, and then you get certified as I think it's a certified criminal defense investigator. There's state organizations in almost every state. There's a couple that don't. Some of them have continuing education classes. But a lot of those are like pertain to stuff that I don't do.
Okay.
It's like I said before, I'm like 99% criminal defense. So it's a little harder and a little more specialized to get the criminal defense training. But yeah, there's but there's still programs available for us to do. And Wisconsin doesn't require any CLEs or anything like that. I think they should.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a little, depending on your area of expertise, you just got to know where to look to find the courses and classes.
So what was the process for you to become like a licensed private investigator?
It was way too easy.
Okay.
Let's see. I think I had to start my business first. So I formed my LLC first. Then I think I had to have insurance. Then I think I applied for my agency license, then my personal license. I took a test, and then I got my license.
Okay.
That was it.
So there's not as much oversight as people might think in terms of, barriers to entry. Like you could feasibly do it, if you just wanted to do it.
Not in Wisconsin. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Do other states have higher standards?
Some of them do, yeah. I'm pretty sure it's Nevada that's like really high. I think they've only had, it's either 1,000 or 10,000. One of the zeros either comes off or stays on.
Sure.
But they've only had like that number of PIs throughout the whole history of the state. So like,
wow.
It's really hard for Nevada. I think California is more restrictive.
Interesting.
California is more restrictive because you have to have like apprenticeship hours, I think.
Okay.
Florida, Texas. See, Colorado doesn't have licensing, but yeah, I think Wisconsin's like one of the easier ones.
Interesting.
Which, good or bad, depending on how you look at it.
Yeah, obviously, just like there are with attorneys, there are going to be some people that are really good at it, and there's other people not so much. I think the biggest thing, though, is really like the passion and the willingness to like roll up your sleeves and do the work.
Yes.
And I think that applies, for attorneys and for investigators alike, just because there's a lot of things you can learn, and there's a lot of people that are willing to share their knowledge with you.
Yeah.
It's one of the things I really enjoy, because it's like, yes, coming from a small office, you still have people that you can call or email, and they'll talk to you. And I think that's kind of a cool aspect about this area of law, is that people are pretty collegial. Like they want to see people do well, and they want to, work for the good of all of our clients, right? I mean, that's kind of how it is. So do you find that that's the same, in your arena as well?
Surprisingly, yeah. Let me walk that back a little bit. More of like my connections on LinkedIn, just because it's so easy. There's a certain investigator in Arizona that like I've talked to, and he's giving me lots of tips and things like that, and where to look for stuff. I find that and he's more specialized too. I think he only does like criminal defense and like maybe truck accidents or something like that.
Sure.
But I found it's the people that aren't willing to share that are the investigators that try to do everything.
Yeah.
Defense, surveillance, civil, cheating spouses, things like that.
Yeah. I find that the aspect of being a generalist is kind of a double-edged sword. I mean, there's places where like geographically understand, if you're going to go way up north, you're probably not going to find too many people that specialize in one area or focus on one area. But the reality is you can definitely try to do too many things. And I find that most people who do a million different things aren't doing any of them very well. That just kind of is the nature of the game. So yeah.
So that's why I try to go to the specialized investigators and talk to them, or pick their brains, or buy their books or their courses, things like that, because they're more focused on what I actually want to do. And they have more experience. Not ashamed to say that they're smarter than me. So I like to take things that they use.
I mean, that makes perfect sense. I mean, I'm always buying books from like NACDL, so the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. They have some really good stuff depending on the type of case that you're working on. And, the funny part is that like a bunch of their presenters are actually from here too. So there are some people that are very well involved in our area that participate on a national level. So, I mean, it's just been such a good resource to have all of those things where like, it's just, you don't know what you don't know, and the only way that you can get better is to continually, learn, and that's just how it goes. So, it's interesting too, because I think sometimes people assume that like the older you are, that the better you are at your job, and that is. It's debatable, right? I mean, there's absolutely some people that have been doing things for a long time and they're really good at it. There's also other people that routinely underestimate the skill level that a younger attorney or, newer investigator or whatever has. When, I find that, and I don't consider myself like super young anymore, but when I first started out, it was one of those things where, you have to be hyper prepared, because people are going to look at you and assume you don't know what you're doing until you start kind of creating that reputation for yourself. And so I always say that like, years in practice doesn't necessarily mean anything, right? That's why I really think that like getting good feedback from clients, when it's warranted and all of that, like the proof is in the pudding, right? Like you can't fake that stuff. So that's always important.
Yeah, getting the results is ultimately what matters the most.
Yeah.
But that's why I ask for like Google reviews or attorneys to mention me on Wackel posts or something,
right?
Because one, it gets your name out there, and two, it shows that despite only being a PI for almost 6 years, I actually know what I'm doing.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and I think too, when people recommend a name, they're saying like, "Hey, I'm vouching for this person," and that goes a long way. We're a small community, I think, of criminal defense attorneys here, but the general consensus is, if they think somebody's good, they're going to give you a name.
Right.
And that's important. I think, as far as Google and stuff too, I mean, the interesting thing about that is, it's hard to compete with like big companies, and that's less so, I feel like, in your particular niche.
Right.
I think an issue, but how do people find you, right? You're out there starting off sending mailers, all of that, but over time, when you develop a reputation, like I think word of mouth like travels very far.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. I still have a website. I couldn't tell you the last time I got a referral from it.
Sure.
It's usually word of mouth, either between defendants like in the jails.
Oh yeah.
Or
they talk all the time. Oh yeah.
All the time.
So what is the furthest away county that you have ever taken a case in?
Probably Juneau County.
Okay.
Yeah.
I forget, what is the city, the county seat of Juneau County? I have no idea.
Boston, maybe?
Boston. Oh, that could be. I'm confusing it with Sauk County because Sauk, they're all like in that general area.
Yeah, over there. I haven't done anything like real up north at all.
Okay. As far as I've been up north was Menominee County. So Shawano Menominee has a shared DA's office because half of it is tribal land. It might be more than half. And so jurisdictionally, that's an interesting intersection for who can prosecute crimes. So I took a case up there, and that was quite a drive, but it turned out well. So I have no complaints. But I like going to random up north counties. It's just kind of one of those things where, especially if you don't have a big team to like cover calendars and stuff, driving 3.5 hours to go somewhere for a 5-minute status is just not practical from that perspective.
Yeah. You guys waste a lot of time.
Yeah.
Driving and going to courts for statuses.
Oh, yeah.
Should all be Zooms or phone calls?
I'm happy that like most places have adapted to doing Zoom. Right. I think that like for efficiency's sake, it just should be the new norm across the board. Not that I have any control over that, but yeah, I mean, especially when there's the cost in mind, right? Because when you have a private client, they're paying you, even, I guess, regardless of your fee structure, right? So whether you do flat fees or you bill hourly, that's incorporated into that when you're figuring, okay, this court is like 4 hours away. I have to now budget an entire day for a hearing, right? So I think those are things where, the court calendar can be more efficient and also be really cost effective for clients to save their money for something more important in terms of whatever else comes along with the case. So
even SPD cases.
Oh yeah.
Granted, they usually try to point around there, but I've been asked to do, from a Milwaukee attorney, been asked to take a case up. I don't remember the county. It was way up north, I think, on the border with the UP.
If you have to like look it up on the map, you're like, oh man, this one's far. I was like, I don't recognize that one offhand.
Right.
So
and just how much time the PD's office, or how much money the PD's office would have to pay just for time. To go there and back.
It's challenging. It's challenging. And I think one of the things that's really interesting about it is, we talk about all the issues and like shortages, and it's like these are concrete areas where like we can improve that and increase access to attorneys in areas where there are not many attorneys to take cases. So but yeah, I think the tide is turning to some degree on that in a positive way, because I think courts and just people in our field in general are realizing like we can be doing this a better, more efficient way in order to kind of keep the wheels of justice turning, right?
Yeah, I've noticed that a little more with like more outlying counties
Yeah.
doing Zooms or even phone calls.
Yeah.
So
Which is great.
hopefully it keeps going.
I hope so too. I mean, I will say that like Zoom has its limitations. Like
Yes.
I don't want to be doing like contested hearings on Zoom.
No.
During like peak COVID, I did one restraining order hearing by video. So it wasn't criminal, but it was, you know, a hearing with testimony and all that. Was not a fan. Was not a fan. And I will tell you that the other attorney had some technical difficulties that like, you know, it just, what can you do?
That's true too. Losing signal or something.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
That is actually one of the biggest issues about kind of the up north situation is because the internet coverage is not that good there, depending on how far north you go.
Yeah.
And so even to accommodate for some of the remote stuff, like the infrastructure and the connection is just not that good. I'm like an aspiring Uper because I really want to go up north. So I spent time in the UP after undergrad in like the western UP bordering Iron County, so Hurley, which is just about as far north as you can go. Superior, Wisconsin would probably be a little bit further north. And my boyfriend has a place up there too, a little bit further up in the UP, and so I really like it. But you know, there was a time where like we would get all of these emails about, you know, taking cases up in these random counties, and it's like like I just, you know, unless you can tell me I can do this by Zoom, and I only have to come up for like a plea and sentencing or like a trial or something like that, like that's gonna be real tough. It's gonna be really tough. So plus I know too with like the whole SPD part of it, like, you know, accommodations, they're covered up to a certain point. There may not be a lot of options, so if you're staying there for like a week-long trial, like that can be kind of complicated in its own way. Yeah. So I mean, it's a tough conversation, and I feel like, you know, it's a challenging conversation to have because, like, you know, obviously there's things that could be better, but I think it is an important conversation to have if we want to bring in, you know, more private bar attorneys to cover that gap. One of the areas that I think is even more frustrating is kind of that gap between folks that can get a public defender appointed to their case, a court-appointed attorney, and then hire private, because there's a pretty significant gap between people that are able to, you know, pay several $1,000s, like just in a moment's notice, right? You know, over something like that. And so, you know, that I think is a challenging perspective as well, because, you know, it costs money to do the job. I mean, it costs money for you to do your job. You're on the road a lot. You're doing all those things. But there also seems to be kind of that gap of like, you know, how do people handle a case on their own? Some people end up going pro se, which I don't think is a good idea in any circumstance. But I understand why people make that decision to say, hey, I can't afford an attorney and I'm working, so I cannot get an appointed attorney. Right. You know, those are things that I think are challenging as well.
Yes. Pro se clients in and of themselves can be challenging.
How do you get connected with a pro se client? I mean, I say that because, like, so anybody can hire you? Maybe we shouldn't plug that on here. Like, we shouldn't plug that on here.
Yeah, mainly through word of mouth in the jail.
Sure. Okay.
I mean, that's usually what it is. What I've noticed is a lot of it is, like you said before, they want someone to talk to, someone to listen to their side of the story.
Sure.
Because they've generally been appointed attorneys that just have so many cases, they don't come to meet with them.
Sure.
They don't know what the defense is. They don't know client's side.
Sure.
Things like that. So they just go through 5 or 6 attorneys and eventually do it themselves. And then, I'm there more than I want to be.
Sure.
But I'm there going over everything with them, listening to them, going over, you know, what I've got, what I've found.
Yeah.
So, a lot of it is they just want someone to, I don't know if it's actually someone to believe them.
Sure.
But just to have that person there for them.
Yeah. There's absolutely an element of this job that is, you know, that counselor at law, right, thing. Like,
yes,
you know, there's an aspect where it's like sometimes the issue has nothing to do with the case, but it's just kind of all of the high emotions, and like you have to kind of close the file, set it aside, and be like, what's going on, you know? And there's that humanity component that I try to remember, because I know that, you know, after a sentencing, or, you know, if there's a guilty verdict or whatever, I get to pack my stuff up and I get to leave the table and go home. And you have to kind of reframe that sometimes and remember that even though you're doing this job, like, for this one person, it is probably the only thing that they are thinking about
Right.
while that case is pending.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's their whole life. The homicide that I referenced that got dismissed in October last year, I mean, he got picked up from Washington in February, was dismissed in October, but yeah, that whole time, it's all he thought about.
Yeah.
Like from the moment he picked up and I first met with him, he's like, this isn't true. This isn't true. I'm like, I know.
Yeah.
Just let me get discovery so I can go through discovery and stuff.
Right.
But yeah, it was a fun case to do, but when you actually have innocent clients,
Right.
like actual innocence, not
Right.
self-defense or things like that,
Sure.
those are the ones that weigh on you the most.
Yeah.
And the case definitely did.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad the correct outcome was achieved, especially without
Me
going
too.
through the stress of trial, right? Because,
Yes.
yes, it's very sexy to have a not guilty verdict, but honestly, if you could save that stress and just that feeling and putting your client through that, whether your client has to testify, all that stuff, it's less glamorous, but I would much rather take a dismissal, 100%. And I think a lot of people wouldn't necessarily say that out loud. You know what I mean? They probably would, like, privately, because it's like, oh, it's so glamorous to get the acquittal. But at the same time, if you can achieve that result without putting the client through all of that, I would say that's a win. That's a huge win.
I agree. Yeah, it's nice that jeopardy attaches with
Yeah.
the not guilty, but to have the state basically say, we can't prove this anymore.
Right.
We're not even going to take it to trial.
Right.
It's a good feeling.
Yeah.
I like that.
Absolutely. Plus, I think, too, there's all the collateral aspects of, like, once a case is dismissed or if a case is, taken to trial and you win at trial, like getting the arrest record removed, like all of those things that, really trying to close that chapter for somebody and move on is, kind of part of my job that I like to do as like a finishing touch, simply because, any interaction, any involvement with, the criminal legal system carries significant consequences.
Yes.
Even after a case is done, right?
Yeah.
Especially if it's a case that's very publicized and, all of that stuff that, sometimes we're in a position where, the client loses their entire support network because people don't believe them.
Yes.
Or, it's a situation where they've lost their job. And, trying to restore that and bring it back is just a little part of, what we can help with in terms of trying to put that back together after the heavy lifting is done.
Right.
So,
Right. Yeah. Going back to the homicide again.
Yeah.
I mean, it was a relatively publicized case. So, there's news articles back in Washington. So
Yeah.
when he eventually went back to try to get his job, in there it says, it's dismissed without prejudice, so it can
Right.
be retried.
right.
Yeah. So he didn't get his job back
Right.
because they saw that.
And I think
And it's,
that's where, I think more understanding of what these concepts mean is important, right? Because yes, while that's true, to your point, it also means that the state said, I'm looking at this case and I don't think that I can prove this. Like, that's huge, and that should mean something. I have a love-hate relationship with CCAP because you can get so much good information off CCAP. However, at the same time, while there are these disclaimers and things, if charges have been dismissed or, there's been an acquittal, whatever, and eventually it comes off after 2 years,
Right.
if it's dismissed or there's an acquittal. But, like, I will routinely have people calling me saying, hey, my employer's going to see this. Like, how do I explain this? Because a lot of the way that bigger companies now do HR, it's all automated. And so they see something that's flagged on the background check.
Right.
And it's not a real human being to really assess, like, what's going on, particularly like for rideshare drivers, right? Like, that's a huge issue.
I didn't even think about
Yeah,
that.
with like traffic records and rideshare drivers, because it's almost impossible to get in touch with a real human being to explain, like, here's what this was, right? Or they reopened it. And that's a very minor example, but it's also something that could potentially cost somebody the ability to make money to provide for their family, right? So,
Right.
those are things where, in certain instances, like, clients have just said, like, I want you to explain this to my HR person. And I'm like, yeah, like, I'm happy to do that. If you're cool with that, I will explain it, because a lot of times people see this stuff, they have no clue what it means. And, it looks way more aggravated than what it is, or, you know, they won't understand necessarily what happened on this particular entry. And so, I mean, I at least, you know, give credit to people that are willing to at least kind of hear that explanation. But I think sometimes that can be overwhelming for a client to have to navigate on their own, even at the end of all of that. So yeah, it's you never want to get caught up in something because it will follow you. And I have such beef with, like, I don't know. I think there are a lot of uninformed postings that you'll see by like news media that do not characterize things correctly.
All the time.
There was something during the Darrell Brooks trial that, you know, and again, I mean, regardless of what people think about him as an individual, the concept was somebody had written something about like having to prove his innocence. And I'm like, how can you not know that that is a fundamentally wrong statement about how this all works?
Right.
You know, because if you're going to put this stuff out to the public, they should at the very least be able to confidently look at this and say, this is an accurate statement of what.
There was a news article?
Yeah, it was, the Freeman. Like, it was a social media post. And what they had written, like, above the post basically said that. And I shared it and was like, this is why this is important, because this is completely wrong. Right. Regardless of how you feel about this individual defendant, that's not accurate, you know?
That's not how it works.
So I don't know if they changed it, because I like, you know, can't just send angry letter to editor emails all day. But I mean, those are aspects where, like, you see it in the Facebook comments, you'll see it on social media, where people are very confused about what actually goes on, like bad legal takes on X, formerly Twitter. I keep saying Twitter. Like, X just doesn't roll off the tongue the same way. No. So yeah, but there's this account called Bad Legal Takes, and it's usually like very misconstrued takes, a lot of them about criminal law. And I was like, ooh, like, this is so bad. And then you see like the ratios and you're like, oh my gosh, people actually think that this is accurate. Right. And it's not.
Yeah, so. I've seen, juries that think that the client has to prove they're innocent of the facts, and like, no. So then you got to go through voir dire to explain to them that that's not how this works.
Yeah.
Like, the state has that burden. So yeah, a lot of people that aren't informed, and maybe even a lot of misinformation out there regarding it.
Yeah.
Which is unfortunate.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that with like voir dire, like, I'll always ask really basic questions, just even I want to assume, right, that they know nothing. Like, I don't want to assume that things I think are very implicit are very obvious, because they're not. But I've kind of, I've been fortunate enough to have some really good like sounding boards on how to like get people talking, and it's always an interesting and insightful discussion for the most part. I don't think I've had a panel where people like were absolutely silent.
That's good.
Yeah. I mean, that's never enjoyable, but yeah. And it's funny too, because it's like we talk about like, you understand like this person doesn't have to testify if they don't want to. That's their absolute right. But honestly, like, how many of you actually want to hear what they have to say? And like, a lot of people will raise their hands because they're expecting that, and so I appreciate at least people being candid enough to say like, yeah, like, I get it, but realistically I want to hear this, because it just, you kind of get that emotional quality of like, it's storytelling. People want to hear stories and they want to know, I think it's a fundamental idea that like there's two sides of a story or many sides to a story. Right. So I always find that stuff really interesting, but yeah, I never go into it assuming that people understand some of these things, because, even very well educated, it's not an educational thing. It's just the fact that like, we don't really talk about what your rights are in a criminal case very often. And so you find yourself learning that if you are in that situation. A lot of my clients have never been in trouble before. I think that a lot of the clientele that I have are people that are overwhelmed. They're really nervous and scared because they probably haven't been in the system before. And so they have no concept of what is going to happen, what that means, all of those things where, it just, I think it's so easy for us because we talk to people in that arena like all day. But I've tried to kind of distill some of these concepts down in ways that, you know, they can share with family and friends, because they're always going to get questions and people are always so nervous, you know. They'll, like, for example, people will look and see like, oh, it's the maximum penalty on the criminal complaint, and assume like I'm going to prison for, you know, X amount of years. And I'm like, no, that's not what we're saying. But like, you know, just examples like that are just interesting to kind of make sure that people actually know what's going on in the process.
I'm just, like, when I go meet with clients, you know, they're always asking like, how can this happen? How can this happen? And like, sometimes I don't think there's a good way for me to say it. Then, you know, that's just how it is. You know, how can they keep you here for that long? Unfortunately, you know, they can, unless you can raise the money to post. Which,
well, that's one thing. That's an aspect of Wisconsin law that is unique, because a lot of people expect that you can pay like a bail bondsman and put like a portion down, but like the court says $250,000 cash. That's what they mean. And so that is, I've had a number of people call about stuff like that, and they're really surprised to hear that. So yeah, I mean, there's aspects that like there are no good answers to. You know, you just
or sex assault cases where it's just he said, she said. You know, I'm sure you get that a lot too. Like,
I mean,
how can they take her word for this and not mine? And
I mean, I feel like sensitive crimes, and when I say sensitive crimes, I guess I mean more so domestic abuse and sex assault cases are still very gendered. Like they are. And I think that that's a reality that, again, is, you know, something that's worth talking about, because I think, you know, there is a credibility assessment that law enforcement makes when they begin an investigation. And more often than not, the man isn't necessarily getting the benefit of the doubt. But it's also, you know, there's interesting dynamics too, because I've had cases involving same-sex couples, and so like all of those ideas are kind of challenged in a way that, you know, what is our traditional like understanding of, you know, intimate partner violence and things like that. Like, what does that look like, right? Because it's not always as obvious. Because I've definitely represented women that were accused of, you know, assaulting their husbands, and it does happen. So I think, you know, but I very much understand like why people get frustrated, especially when there really isn't a whole lot, you know, to go off of. I mean, because I don't think that most people realize that, like, you know, a disorderly conduct domestic abuse charge could be just about anything, right? Based just about anything. You could get in.
You can get it.
100%. And so many times people will say like, I called the police because I just wanted them to separate us and like talk to him and just like whatever. And it's like, no, they don't have the discretion. If they think that there was a domestic abuse offense committed, they have to arrest somebody. Like they have to. So that is, again, an aspect where now you've got a case that's in court. You may also have, you know, the individual that's the alleged victim not wanting to pursue charges for a legitimate reason. I think there's always kind of this assumption that it must be because of, you know, the power and control wheel and all that stuff, right? Like, but sometimes these are very benign fact patterns that by and large just happen because someone called the cops, and like, you know, it could be just a really bad drunk evening or something like that that did not involve with, you know, anyone really getting hurt, anything like that. And, you know, once that ball is rolling, I always tell people it's really up to the prosecutor to what they're going to do. You know, whether or not somebody else has a different take on it, like the prosecutor has the ultimate discretion as to whether or not they're going to pursue that case. And that is an often unpopular conversation, because people are like, how is this possible? Like, how can they don't have anything? It's like, well, you know, there are some counties where they will routinely ask for a material witness warrant to bring somebody into court that doesn't want to be there, you know? And so you got to ask yourself, like, is that a good use of tax dollars? I would say no, but I mean,
I would agree.
You know, I think those are the things that, again, I think most people don't know about until they're involved in that. And so those are conversations that I think are important in terms of what drives policy and that sort of thing. And I say that with the caveat of I've never been a prosecutor. I will never be a prosecutor. So I get that I have, my opinions on that side of things.
Right.
But I also think that from like a practical perspective, you see different, pros and cons on both sides. And I think that it always is helpful to be cognizant of those things when you decide like what is gonna, we're really gonna wait 2 years to go to trial on a case like this. Like,
right.
Okay, like, so.
Yeah, those are my least favorite cases.
Yeah.
I just gotta say that because, you have like you said, generally the woman that just called because they wanted to be separated or just wanted him out for the night or something.
Yeah.
And then she wants to try to take it back. But obviously the DA isn't going to let that happen because they believe the initial statement and those are hard to do.
Well, and different counties handle them very differently, and that's what people don't understand. Milwaukee County handles them very differently than any other county for the most part.
Yes.
And people understand that, right? So it's a very different dynamic, whereas, people are surprised. They're like, are you kidding me? Like, this person's going to be hauled into court. I'm like, that's a real possibility. Like, but yeah, I mean, I think that those are things where it just kind of is frustrating. What really gets me is like, I don't do any family law, but I have colleagues who do family law. And quite honestly, a lot of the DV cases that I have done have like a companion divorce case involved. And so very coincidentally, there's never been any issue between this particular couple up and until the point where someone's asking for a divorce. And now, surprise, we have this criminal case that goes along with it.
Right.
And a lot of times, courts they want to pass the buck between each other to not make a decision as to, contact or no contact when it relates to children and things like that, because they say, well, there's a criminal case pending and that's concerning. But we don't want to do anything, right now. And, they have to get all these people involved. And it just is very frustrating just knowing how long it takes to get a case to trial, number one. Yeah. And then number two, to, untangle all of that. And like that frustrates me. So those are situations where it's like, without other evidence, right? With this in the backdrop, like these cases don't make a lot of sense. I mean, it's pretty clear, at least to me, kind of where that motivation lies.
Right.
And I think the general public, like at least cases that I've had that have gone as far as, actually getting to trial in a case like that, like they've been pretty critical thinkers about it too. So I will say that is good. And I think that the juries by and large do take that stuff seriously, but it's also frustrating to see like a case like that make it as far as like, why are we in trial for 2 days on this? Like, that makes no sense.
No, not at all.
So,
Yeah.
I don't know. I like to think I'm pretty reasonable because, I like to ask for reasonable things at the outset, but that doesn't always happen. So,
yeah. It usually takes a lot of work on our end to get to something that we think is reasonable.
Yeah.
How you said you mentioned something like right away. Yeah, but you got to put the work in to show why it's reasonable and things like that. And I think that's where PIs can come in and do that work that either you're too busy to do or you can't do because you become a witness.
Right.
So, yeah, there's a lot of my cases end in pleas too.
Right.
But a lot of the work that I do drives to that plea that, is not necessarily favorable to the client, but it's better than, the initial offer or something like that.
Right. And I think too, you'll get an initial offer many times in a case, or you won't, depending on the seriousness. Sometimes it's always going to be plea to the charge and, whatever, prison up to court. But that being said, like that initial offer is, people have to remember that's not coming with any background information about you. That's assuming the facts that are in the police reports, like that investigation, like that's where that comes from. And a lot of times, I can go back and tell the prosecutor that you're the best person in the world. That's not going to move the dial because they're concerned about what can I prove or like where can you meet me somewhere in there. So I think that's a dynamic where people aren't always aware that, just because you have no criminal record, like that doesn't always mean anything. Yeah. And so prosecutors, I think where you get somewhere is to really, do what you're talking about and to show that like, hey, there might be some problems here with your case. Like, how can we meet somewhere in the middle, right? And And so that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I've had 2 sentencings relatively recently where did extensive work to get to the plea and sentencing.
Sure.
To argue up to the court where clients got probation for pretty serious charges, not like a homicide or anything like that, because that's not going to happen.
Right.
But yeah, it just takes so much work sometimes to do that and just get to that point.
Right.
Which,
right.
in a perfect world, obviously that'd be done at the beginning for budget reasons, for time reasons, but it's just not how it works.
Yeah. I think that's an aspect too where, when we're talking about like mitigation reports, things like that, that is an opportunity where you're not exactly telling your side of the story from the same perspective of like presenting your evidence that you would at trial. But, when we talk about what courts look at when they're sentencing somebody, the defendant's character, that's like a big component of the factors they're supposed to consider. Right. And that's the biggest component that the state often just has no concept of, and I understand why, like it's not really part of their assessment. That's not what they're looking at.
Right.
But it is something where, those are things that I find that if you can demonstrate to the court why a particular sentence makes sense for all of those reasons, and the more detailed that you can be as to why this makes sense, why this works, they're doing X, Y, and Z, they've got this set up, they've got work lined up, like all of this stuff, that is sometimes, extremely helpful for the court to try to craft their decision. Right. And, it's something that I think can sometimes be overlooked, right? There's a lot of, I think, important stuff that, like I said, that you can help with in terms of compiling all this information and getting something to where we can present it in a way that is the most beneficial for the client when it comes for that time.
Right. The most recent sentencing that I had was, do a brief story real quick. It was a Brinks truck that got robbed.
Okay.
Client had worked there. State said he was the mastermind. He's the one that talks to all these people and everything like that. And that was, their decision. They were going to trial on that. Maybe it was 2 months before trial was supposed to start. We got more discovery from the FBI and everyone, because it's like a bank robbery, basically. So the feds are involved. We got a bunch of call records and stuff. I don't think it was worth the risk for Kyle or for it to go to trial. So he ended up pleading to the charge, but free to argue.
Sure.
So, up to the court to sentence him. So I went through all that discovery. It was like 2 gigabytes from the feds.
Yeah.
And showed that there were, 30 calls between the person that we said was the mastermind from the beginning to this other person that was like quasi-involved.
Sure.
And then, calls from the mastermind to this person, because there were like, I think 5 or 6 people total charged, but like 12 people involved. So just doing a lot of that extra work that was never followed up on just helped for, sentencing and mitigation, and he ended up getting probation off of, I think, a felony C class.
That's a big deal.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a really big deal.
Yeah, and just following up on stuff that wasn't followed up on.
Yeah.
So that's what a lot of my job entails.
I mean, it's so interesting too, because especially when you're talking about like big governmental agencies, I mean, like and complex crimes, the volume of discovery that is involved is huge.
Yes.
And that in and of itself, when you think about sitting down to take the time to go through all of it, like, yes, I have to go through it, but having somebody else to comb through that with like a totally fresh take, right? Because you kind of look at this and you look at the same stuff over and over. There's things that like, somebody will point out that you're like, oh, like that didn't occur to me, or I didn't make that connection, right? And so, I mean, just having somebody to go through all of that, right? Because I don't even think, I'm going to be honest, like, I don't think in many cases the state goes over that discovery until and unless they go to trial. And I mean, quite honestly, I'm certain they don't, because, you'll have conversations or you'll get into court and you'll be like, okay, like, and that becomes evident, right? Probably shouldn't be that way if you're going to charge a case, but that's an aspect where I think we benefit from preparedness, because I mean, a good criminal defense team is going to know the ins and outs of everything in a case. Right. And I think the more detailed you can be with the court, the more credible you are. It may not always get you the outcome that you want, but it does impact that credibility. And I think that can help your clients in the long run, for sure.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Whether it's going all the way to a trial or, going to a plea and sentencing.
Yeah.
I mean, it's to have all those facts and be able to present everything to the judge or the jury, I think is the most important thing. Because like you said, I know the state doesn't go through everything because, again, how can they? They have so many cases.
Right.
It's just not feasible for them to do that.
I mean, and that's an aspect, too, where, people get frustrated because a case gets charged so after the fact, right?
Yes.
You're talking about most felony cases, you've got 6 years to make a charging decision, right? So, I mean, that could feasibly sit on someone's desk for quite some time. And depending on what else is going on, I mean, all of that stuff then, it's frustrating because people kind of move on with their life and then they get a summons in the mail or there's an arrest warrant out for them, which is wild. But regardless, those are things where, just the sheer volume of referrals coming into a DA's office is also quite large. And so the reality is that, I don't think that it's necessarily all from a place of I don't think it's necessarily from a place of malicious intent, but I do think that clearly the staffing and just the volume and different things that offices have to deal with does impact our clients in a negative way.
Oh, I agree. Yeah. I don't think it's malicious or intentional to try to I'm going to get that guy.
Right.
But it's just everyone's overworked.
Right.
The
system is overtaxed. Yes. I mean, it really is. How you solve those problems, I don't know. I mean, but that's where I think those conversations at a larger policy level are important to have with people that are actually working in the area, right? As opposed to people that are kind of in the legislature and not really involved in talking to people. I mean, obviously good legislators will speak to people and get input, but I think that's where some of the reactionary lawmaking, I think, doesn't really help anything. And so it's always challenging. And I try to sort of keep up on some of the crazy things that are happening, more so at the state level.
Crazy things.
Yeah. I mean, I think, I've always said state and local level is the stuff that's really significantly going to impact day-to-day stuff. I think for criminal courts as well, by and large. I mean, what happens on a national scale, yes, there's an impact, but what your state assembly is doing, right? All of that kind of stuff really can trickle down into, what goes on a day-to-day basis, right? I mean, we just had a big bail reform that went through as a result of the Waukesha Christmas Parade in large part. And that fundamentally changed the factors that a court considers when determining, what an appropriate bail is for somebody. And, prior to that, the public safety considerations weren't really in part of the conversation. It was just, what's going to make sure that they come back to court.
Right.
And so, that's an example of something huge at a local level that has really far-reaching impact that, again, kind of came out of a situation that was obviously a really bad situation. I mean, my office was not far from there. At the time, my office was actually around the corner from there. I used to have an office on Main Street, and one of my neighbors had called me to see if I was at the parade that day, and I fortunately was not. But it was obviously a bad situation. I was trying to defend that behavior. And I think that's where people get the wrong idea about people that work on the defense side of things. They think that we, by virtue of taking on the cases that we do, that we somehow condone criminal behavior. And I think that that's totally inaccurate, right? But I think, it comes down to recognizing that the role that we do is very important for everybody, regardless of if you're in the position of the defendant or the community at large. I mean, it's just such an important job. Because otherwise, I mean, the reality is, and you've seen it too, I mean, we've talked about all these things that haven't been thoroughly investigated or leads that haven't been followed. I think people have to ask themselves, are they comfortable, with them potentially being in the hot seat, being convicted on a case where a lot of work wasn't done? or a lot of questions were still unanswered.
Yeah.
And that's a concerning thing, and that everybody should care about, regardless of how they feel about, issues. Like, I think that's such a fundamental thing to think about.
Yeah.
I try to reframe it that way because I think people are more receptive to like understanding that versus like just making it like a bad, good versus evil type situation. Because that's a lot of, you see a lot of conversations and comments on the internet that are, of that flavor, for sure.
Everyone just assumes we're horrible people.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I've definitely had people like directly comment on my socials, like, how could you defend somebody like this? I had a person that I was representing in a harassment injunction that ended up being de novoed, and it was this whole thing that months later the petitioner wrote some stuff on my Facebook page that is pretty wild in that vein. So accused me of paying off the judge and other things of that nature. Wow. So which it's not funny, but the funny part is like, honestly, like, you think I'm making that much money? Like, that's like, that's impressive. But no, but I mean, you get this flavor of like people trying to project clients' conduct onto you, or assuming that every single client you work with must be guilty, because why would they be charged, right?
Or why would they hire an attorney before talking?
Right. I mean, all of those misconceptions that I think people hold to really strongly until and unless they're in a situation, God forbid, that they need those services themselves.
Yes.
And then they can understand quite a bit, differently why those things matter.
Yes.
So I remember back when the Gabby Petito story was like in the news. I did some conversations about that on TikTok, and those videos got a lot of feedback simply because I think people wanted to know, like, why would you hire an attorney, like, if you're not guilty or guilty? I mean, like, either way, right? Like, they thought it was super suspect for the boyfriend to like hire an attorney, and like, obviously things turned out, that it is what it is, right? But I think the bigger issue was, if you look at data about, false confession cases, you look at data about, wrongful conviction stats, and there's significant stuff. There's some really good podcasts that the Wrongful Conviction podcast is a really good one. I haven't listened lately, but there's a lot of good insight from these cases where it's like, okay, you should probably rather be safe than sorry. When it comes to all of those things. And it's less a public perception issue. Like, don't be worried if somebody thinks, I mean, no one's going to assume that you're guilty because you got a lawyer.
Right.
I mean, the issue is like, protecting yourself.
Yeah.
And the rights that you have, and the police know you have those rights. That's the other thing too. And they get irritated when you know that you have those rights.
Right.
A lot of times. I think that a lot of police investigation banks on the fact that people do not know what their constitutional rights are.
Right.
And, like, there's good and bad aspects, about that. I get it. The police have a job to do and that sort of thing. But there's also enough stuff that happens in a gray area that I think more people should be concerned about the fact that we don't know about this stuff.
Yeah. I think that's why, like, you see police go in several times to try to interview someone. Maybe they don't want to talk the first time, but they don't invoke.
Right.
So they go back, and then they go back.
Right.
And eventually they go back enough, and then I'm sure you've seen it. I know I've seen it.
Yeah.
Person talks.
Or they'll invoke, and then after a period of time they'll start talking again. Right? Like
that too. Yep.
It just, the magic words don't work unless you also remain silent after. like that's the key component, right? And sometimes, like, that's so frustrating to see, because in a lot of circumstances courts will say, well, no, you voluntarily engaged in conversation with the police, so we're not going to suppress this statement.
I do think rightfully so. Once you invoke, just be quiet. Stop talking.
I mean that is, and be clear cut about it, right? Like, be firm, and unequivocal is the word, right? But like, be clear about it. Don't make it a question. Don't don't hedge. Should I? I was like, yeah, you probably should, but they're waiting for you to say, I want a lawyer. So yeah, I think those are things that I have a bone to pick with some of the nuances of the law, because I think it doesn't take into consideration a lot of other factors. I mean, I had a case with a client that had some, I would say some learning disabilities, some issues of that nature. And when the cop brought him in to give a statement, the way that he prefaced Miranda rights was to say, hey, like, you've seen people get their Miranda rights read in the movies, right? Like, you get what that's about, right? And of course, like, I mean, like, that's not entirely accurate. And a lot of times it's not accurately portrayed in Law and Order or anything that you see on TV. But like, that was the flavor of which he started that interrogation. Unfortunately, I had this whole suppression motion like teed up about, kind of like comprehension of Miranda rights and like, okay, like that's fine that you can read them, but like, do you actually understand what that means and those sorts of things? Unfortunately, we didn't have to actually litigate it because they were able to come down off the felony charges, and that was really good. But situations like that like always make me uneasy, because I'm like, like that's not really fair. And that's,
right.
The law sometimes doesn't take into consideration some of those factors, right? Like, Illinois just made it so that you can't lie in juvenile confessions, which is amazing.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, you can't lie in order to get a confession from a juvenile, but that's not the case across the board. I think people don't realize that the police can lie to you in order to get information. And like, they're very shocked to hear that stuff, but it happens all the time.
Right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. To be fair, I haven't really seen it too much.
Yeah.
So they're usually, pretty honest in the interviews and stuff I've watched. I've never ran into, a detective say, we have you on camera footage.
Sure.
Things like that. But they twist stuff.
Yeah.
But I haven't seen them like outright lie, which I'm surprised I haven't.
I think a lot of them toe the line very closely to issues that, like, from a court's perspective, you can see why somebody's bringing emotion about this issue, because it's like the inference is very strong, right? Yes. But, that in and of itself, I think is, almost worse to a degree, because it's like, okay, like you're pushing and pushing as far as you can to try to get somebody to give you what they want. And then, oh, by the way, like, here's the situation, I had a situation with a guy that was, it was a snowmobile fleeing. Did you know that that's a separate charge from...
Shouldn't it just be a fleeing?
You would think. It's actually a totally different statute. And
Really?
It's one that carries a mandatory minimum jail time, unlike the misdemeanor fleeing variation, right? And it was this case involving DNR wardens who, like, what I've noticed is that they don't deal with a lot of criminal stuff often. So
Right.
A lot of the ways that they will do things, I think, are a little bit, demonstrates the lack of experience in that regard, right? And, they had my guy like handcuffed to the hospital bed because he had been involved in an accident. When they found him, he was pretty banged up. And, they're just like, yeah, we just want to talk to you about what happened. It's not a big deal. You might get a ticket. It's not a big deal. You might get a ticket. Okay, sure, fine. Well, actually, we can't let you leave here. Now that you've spilled the beans, we are going to take you into custody. And by the way, you're being charged with fleeing. We're going to send in that referral. So I was like, wait a minute. Like, that doesn't seem fair. Like, from a fundamental perspective, it's
Right.
kind of like mislead and whatever. But I mean, those are just like minor examples, but you see them play out in much more serious cases. And it's like, oh, like, it's just, it's
Right.
very frustrating and kind
Yes.
of, the more that you look into it, it is a little concerning, especially when we're talking about people that are vulnerable for whatever reason. Like,
Yeah.
that is concerning. And I don't think that most people would condone that behavior, but I think most people don't realize how those things happen and all of those kinds of, other circumstances that might apply. I think people just always assume that, like, you kind of know what you're doing. And so, like, if you've admitted to something, then that's on you.
Right.
But, there's definitely people with different issues that can contribute that I think, I can see where, being stuck in a room and, you're seated across some police officers and you don't know when you're going to go home, that sort of thing. Like, it makes sense that might be a different situation than, just you or I.
Yeah.
Which,
Yeah. I don't know what I would do
I mean, I think it's
don't know.
easy for people to say that, like,
Right.
well, like, I would definitely remember to do X, Y, and Z, and I would, you know, but I don't know, like, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't know what that pressure would look like. And,
Right.
and so that's always, yeah, I don't want to be in that situation, but
No, never.
don't anticipate that it will happen, but, you know.
Right.
But then it's wild too, because like you hear of like attorneys getting in trouble, like in criminal trouble and stuff, like famous attorneys and stuff.
Right.
And then you're like, why did you talk to the cops, man? Like, you should know better than that. And
Yeah.
I don't know. So
Yeah.
I'm not really sure what the component is that drives people to do it, but it's got to be deeper than just like the head knowledge portion, because
Oh yeah.
like, how does an attorney do that? You know?
Yeah, it's got to be something, I don't know, makes you want to try to clear your name or
Yeah,
something
absolutely.
psychological.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for coming on today. It has been a pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you for having me.
I hope you'll come back.
I will.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button for more conversation about all things criminal law. Thanks.